Few games in recent years have generated as much discussion before and immediately after their launch as Stellar Blade. Before anyone had even played the game months before its release in April 2024, people had already decided what it represented. Some hailed it as a return to classic action games, others dismissed it as nothing more than fanservice. Caught in the middle of the culture war surrounding modern game development, almost everyone forgot to talk about the game itself. But Stellar Blade didn't appear out of nowhere. It wasn't developed by an established Japanese giant like Square Enix or Capcom. Instead, it came from Shift Up, a South Korean studio founded by Hyung, the former art director of NCSoft, best known for his work on Blade and Soul. Although the studio had built its reputation through successful mobile titles, Stellar Blade marked its first AAA console project. During its 5-year development cycle, the project changed engines, changed publishers, and gradually evolved into one of PlayStation's most successful new intellectual properties. So today we are going to look at Stellar Blade for what it actually is: a video game. We'll examine its combat, progression systems, level design, and overall experience. While I won't ignore the controversy surrounding its release, I also don't want this video to become another chapter into the endless culture war. That being said, I do believe it's worth discussing where criticism ends and attempts to influence creative decisions begin. Whether the subject is games, films, books, or any other form of artistic expression, censorship deserves to be examined critically. Likewise, I strongly disagree with the rhetoric and approach taken by outlets such as Kotaku, IGN France, and several others during the game's pre-release discourse. My name is Henry Hoffman Myers, I'm your humble hex grid scientist, and if you enjoy this kind of content, consider subscribing for more in-depth analysis of video games as interactive systems. With that out of the way, let's talk about Stellar Blade. Aside from the aesthetics and the design philosophy behind Stellar Blade, combat was a big selling point. At its core, Stellar Blade isn't a game about dealing as much damage as possible. It's about controlling the flow of combat. The player isn't immediately overwhelmed with endless combos or forced to rely purely on reflexes. The game encourages observation, timing, and deliberate decision making. Every mechanic introduced throughout the game serves that central philosophy. But this particular philosophy, at a much deeper glance, is a strange mix of multitude other design philosophies. Let me explain. At first glance, comparisons to NieR Automata seem inevitable. The post-apocalyptic setting, the android protagonist, and even the visual representation all invite that comparison. But once you pick up the controller, those similarities quickly begin to fade. Mechanically, Stellar Blade is a fascinating blend of several action subgenres. Its emphasis on perfect parries and breaking an enemy's balance clearly echoes Sekiro, where controlling the opponent's posture is often more important than simply dealing damage. Its combo structure, animation quality, and emphasis on stylish execution borrow heavily from traditional character action games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, encouraging players to stay aggressive instead of constantly retreating. At the same time, enemy attacks carry the weight and commitment typically associated with Soulslike games. Every mistake is punishable, bosses demand pattern recognition, and victory comes through learning rather than overwhelming your opponent. Finally, mechanics such as blink, repulse, beta skills, and burst skills introduce systems that are uniquely Stellar Blade. While their individual ideas may have predecessors, the way they are layered together creates a combat loop that feels distinct from any single game it draws inspiration from. This is perhaps Stellar Blade's biggest achievement. It doesn't reinvent the action genre, instead it carefully studies why so many different combat systems have resonated with players over the years, and combines their strongest ideas into something that feels both familiar and refreshingly original. What ultimately makes this hybrid approach work is that none of these mechanics exist in isolation. Rather than functioning as separate systems, they constantly feed into one another, and they are creating a combat loop that rewards both precision and aggression. A successful offensive sequence generates beta energy, and beta skills deal significant balance damage. Breaking an enemy's balance creates an opportunity for a devastating execution, which in turn contributes toward building burst energy. Those burst skills open even more offensive opportunities, restarting the entire cycle. Instead of presenting combat as a collection of independent mechanics, Stellar Blade turns them into a continuous feedback loop where every successful decision naturally blends to the next. That being said, let's see what Stellar Blade's combat has to offer. You have two types of attacks, light and heavy, that can chain into visually spectacular combo attacks. Holding the heavy attack will launch an impressive and useful gap closer. There are two types of special attacks, each numbering 4 different abilities that can be achieved when some specific conditions are met. Offense is what makes Stellar Blade so satisfying to play. Unlike many modern action RPGs, Eve's moveset isn't built around dozens of interchangeable weapons or an overwhelming number of combo strings. Instead, the game focuses on refining a single weapon and giving every attack a clear purpose. Light attacks are fast and reliable, allowing players to maintain pressure and quickly recover after a defensive maneuver. Heavy attacks are slower but deal significantly more balanced damage, making them ideal for creating openings against tougher enemies. The real depth, however, comes from how these attacks can be chained together. Rather than encouraging players to memorize long combo lists like a traditional character action game, Stellar Blade emphasizes rhythm. Every offensive sequence is designed to flow naturally into the next defensive action, creating a combat loop where attacking and defending become inseparable. This rhythm becomes especially apparent during boss fights. Landing a successful parry isn't simply a reward in itself, it's an invitation to immediately counterattack before preparing for the next exchange. Likewise, an aggressive combo often ends with the player anticipating the enemy's retaliation rather than mindlessly continuing to smash buttons. Another strength of the offensive system is its visual feedback. Enemy reactions, sound design, camera movement, and hit effects all communicate a strong sense of impact. Every successful strike feels deliberate and powerful, giving the combat a satisfying weight without sacrificing responsiveness. Perhaps most importantly, the game rarely rewards reckless aggression. Simply attacking as fast as possible usually results in punishment. Instead, Stellar Blade encourages controlled offense, knowing exactly when to push forward and when to return to a defensive stance. That constant shift between pressure and restraint is what gives the combat its distinctive identity. One of the reasons Stellar Blade's combat feels so satisfying has very little to do with its mechanics on paper. Instead, it comes down to the way those mechanics are presented and how every action communicates weight, intention, and consequence to the player. One of the first things you'll notice is animation commitment. Eve can't instantly cancel every attack the moment danger appears. Once you commit to a heavy strike, you are locked into that animation for a brief moment. This may sound restrictive, but is precisely what gives combat its sense of weight. Every attack becomes a conscious decision rather than a button press, forcing players to think about timing and positioning before committing to longer combos. More than so, your attacks won't always interrupt enemies, but their attacks are perfectly capable of stopping yours, making an attack a tactical move. Another subtle but incredibly effective technique is hit stop. Whenever a powerful attack connects, the game briefly freezes the animation for just a few frames before continuing. The pause is almost imperceptible, yet it dramatically increases the perceived impact of every strike. It's a classic technique used in games like Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter, and even many fighting games. And Stellar Blade implements it exceptionally well. Instead of feeling like your sword is slicing through thin air, every successful hit feels like it genuinely collides with something solid. The game also excels at enemy reactions. Different attacks produce different responses depending on their strength and context. Light attacks interrupt weaker enemies, heavy attacks visibly stagger tougher opponents, while beta skills often launch, knock back, or completely overwhelm the target. These reactions provide immediate visual feedback that reinforces the effectiveness of your actions. You can actually see your attacks affecting the enemy's body and posture. This naturally feeds into the game's risk versus reward philosophy. Longer combo strings deal significantly more damage and generate more resources, but they also leave Eve vulnerable for a longer period of time. Greed is frequently punished. Many boss encounters are designed specifically to bait players into overcommitting, only to retaliate the moment they become too aggressive. As a result, maximizing damage isn't about memorizing the longest combo, it's about recognizing when it's actually safe to finish one. Finally, there is the overall animation quality, which ties the entire combat system together. Transitions between attacks, dodges, parries, executions, and special abilities are remarkably fluid. Rather than feeling like separate mechanics stitched together, every moment flows naturally into the next. This seamless blending of animations makes combat feel effortless without sacrificing precision, allowing the player to focus on decision making instead of fighting against the controls. Taken individually, none of these elements are revolutionary. Many action games use animation commitment, hit stop, or reactive enemies. What Stellar Blade does particularly well is combine all of them into a cohesive presentation. The result is a combat system that feels responsive without being weightless, stylish without becoming chaotic, and satisfying even during the most basic encounters. I do think that this is the level of details and possibilities a €70 video game should provide no matter the genre. If the offensive mechanics make Stellar Blade exciting, its defensive mechanics are what give the combat its depth. Unlike many action games where defense is little more than a way to avoid taking damage, Stellar Blade treats it as the primary driver of combat. Every successful defensive action creates an opportunity to attack, making defense just as rewarding as offense. At the heart of this system lies the perfect parry. Rather than simply blocking incoming attacks, a well-timed parry damages the enemy's balance, interrupts their momentum, and gradually pushes them towards a vulnerable state. It's a mechanic that immediately encourages players to stand their ground instead of constantly retreating. For players who prefer mobility, Perfect Dodge offers an equally viable alternative. Executed at the last possible moment, it slows time briefly, repositions Eve, and creates an opening for a powerful counterattack. Instead of asking whether one defensive option is objectively better than the other, the game allows both playstyles to coexist, giving players the freedom to rely on whichever feels more natural. From my own playthrough, I found that perfect parrying is easier to execute correctly and provides more benefits. Don't get me wrong, perfect dodging if executed correctly is way more visually rewarding but less reliable. The defensive systems expand even further through blink and repulse. Certain enemy attacks are marked with distinct visual cues that require specific responses. A successful blink allows Eve to evade an otherwise unavoidable attack while instantly repositioning behind the enemy. Repulse, on the other hand, turns defense into offense by pushing back against powerful strikes. These mechanics transform boss fights into pattern recognition exercises where success depends not only on reflexes but also on understanding which defensive response each attack demands. All of these mechanics feed directly into the game's balance system. Rather than focusing exclusively on reducing an enemy's health bar, Stellar Blade constantly rewards precise defensive play by weakening the opponent's posture. Every perfect parry, successful blink, or well-timed repulse contributes towards breaking the enemy balance, eventually creating an opportunity for a devastating attack. It's a satisfying gameplay loop that ensures every successful defense has an immediate offensive payoff. What makes this system particularly effective is its accessibility. The timing windows are demanding enough to reward mastery but generous enough that new players rarely feel punished for experimenting. Unlike games that require near perfect execution from the very beginning, Stellar Blade gradually teaches its mechanics, introducing new defensive tools one at a time before combining them into more demanding encounters. The result is a combat system that constantly keeps the player engaged. You are rarely waiting for your turn to attack. Even while defending, you are making meaningful decisions, reading animation, recognizing attack patterns, choosing the correct defensive response, and so on. Defense isn't simply about survival, it's the engine that drives the entire combat experience. And I want to make a small reminder here, I praise NieR Automata for visually and auditory rewarding the player when a high skill move is executed. I will reiterate here my support for this approach, and I am really glad to see it pushed to the next level in Stellar Blade. Proper mastery over the offense and defense mechanics is highly rewarded with stunning effects, dopamine inducing sound, and masterfully crafted animations. I believe the product quality presented in this game is worth the money asked. The whole combat combat loop is addictive, and while it heavily borrows inspiration from Dark Souls, it is forgiving enough for you to actually enjoy it most of the time. There are also a couple of extra gimmicks such as backstabbing and aerial assassinations, but I wouldn't say they are the main attraction. Overall, Stellar Blade's combat is clearly a chimera and it borrows heavily from many games. If games like Devil May Cry or Killer is Dead ask the player how stylish can you be, Dark Souls asks the player can you survive, and Stellar Blade is somewhere in between. I do agree it resembles Automata's combat loop, but I also think it improved a lot on the original approach in order to be considered something else entirely. But while I'm sure many of you came to Stellar Blade for the combat, many others, myself included, came for something else entirely.
Chaque note qui s'en évade porte un secret, un battement dans le silence.
Before talking about character design, it's worth separating two concepts that are often confused: graphical fidelity and art direction. A game can have cutting-edge graphics and still feel visually forgettable. Most Unreal Engine 4 games are forgettable in terms of aesthetics. Likewise, a game with modest technology can remain timeless thanks to a strong artistic identity. Both old-school RuneScape and RuneScape 3 are good examples. Fortunately, Stellar Blade succeeds in both areas. From a technical standpoint, the game is among the most impressive Unreal Engine 4 titles ever released. Character models feature an exceptional level of detail, facial animations are expressive, environmental effects such as particles, reflections and volumetric light create scenes that often feel remarkably close to pre-rendered cinematics. Modeling characters using telemetry obtained from a real person is, from my point of view, always a great choice if you can afford it as a game developer. But impressive technology alone doesn't make memorable visuals. What truly elevates Stellar Blade is its art direction. The world constantly contrasts beauty with decay. Rather than relying exclusively on post-apocalyptic cliches, the game builds environments that are simultaneously melancholic, mysterious, and strangely beautiful. This visual contrast extends to the enemies as well. The enemies combine organic forms with unsettling anatomical distortions, making them feel neither entirely biological nor entirely mechanical. Their body structures remain distinctive enough to be immediately recognizable, an important principle of good visual design. Just like in the case of the combat, I got a feeling while playing that I'm revisiting some old places. The world design is definitely heavily inspired from other games. The first that comes to mind is obviously Automata, but I have also seen The Last of Us, Wasteland 2 and many other influences. And I think this is awesome. Managing to port an already beloved aesthetic to your own original world is no small feature. Perhaps the strongest example of the game's artistic confidence, however, is its character design. In recent years, character appearance has become one of the most polarizing topics in the game industry. Stellar Blade found itself at the center of that debate long before players experienced its gameplay. Setting that controversy aside, Eve is simply an exceptionally well-designed protagonist from an artistic perspective. Her silhouette is instantly recognizable. Every outfit preserves a clear visual identity while allowing for a surprising amount of variety. More importantly, the design never sacrifices animation quality. Every movement, attack, dodge and combat transition has clearly been offered with a character model in mind, resulting in animation that feel both fluid and believable. And perhaps the most interesting thing is that none of this is particularly new. This has been a defining characteristic of Japanese and more recently Korean and Chinese character design for decades. Stylized yet elegant proportions, slim silhouettes, youthful facial features and an emphasis on visual appeal are recurring elements across countless games, anime, manga, manhwa and other forms of East Asian media. I bring this up because I struggle to understand why Eve's design became such a controversial topic. When I look at her, I don't simply see an attractive character, I see hundreds if not thousands of hours of work invested into sculpting, retopology, texturing, rigging, animation, shaders, physics and countless artistic iterations required to create a believable AAA quality digital human. From a technical and artistic standpoint, Eve is exceptionally well crafted. Much of that realism also comes from the fact that her appearance is based on the South Korean model Shin Jae-eun, whose body was captured through high-resolution 3D scanning before being further refined by the artists. The final character is certainly stylized, as virtually every video game protagonist is, but its foundation is an actual human being rather than an entirely fictional anatomy. If Eve's design is considered inherently problematic, then consistency would require applying the same criticism to a long list of East Asian games featuring similarly idealized protagonists. Characters from NieR, Drakengard, Where Winds Meet, Black Desert, The First Descendant, Final Fantasy, and many others all follow a comparable artistic philosophy, built around elegant silhouettes, idealized proportions, and highly polished presentation. Ultimately, whether someone personally likes that aesthetic is entirely subjective, but it is, first and foremost, a design philosophy, one that has existed for decades and continues to define much of East Asian character art. And when so much care has gone into creating such a sophisticated character model, it only makes sense that the wardrobe receives the same level of attention. In Stellar Blade, the costumes don't feel like simple cosmetic additions. They feel like an extension of the craftsmanship that went into designing Eve herself. The game's fashion system deserves a particular praise. Unlike many games where cosmetic outfits exist merely as optional collectibles, Stellar Blade treats fashion as part of the player's expression. Dozens of costumes significantly alter Eve's appearance without affecting gameplay balance, allowing players to personalize the experience according to their own preferences. Some outfits embrace high fashion aesthetics inspired by contemporary Korean design, others lean into science fiction, military equipment, casual clothing, or even playful fan service. While not every costume will appeal to every player, the sheer variety ensures that almost everyone can find a style that matches their vision of the character. More importantly, these outfits are not hidden behind microtransactions or premium storefronts. The overwhelming majority are earned simply by exploring the world, completing quests, or discovering hidden areas. At a time when cosmetic monetization has become standard across much of the industry, that decision feels almost refreshing. Whether one personally likes Eve's design or not is ultimately subjective. What isn't subjective is the craftsmanship behind it. The quality of the character modeling, costume design, animation work, and technical presentation places Stellar Blade among the strongest visual showcases of its generation. At the time of writing this script, there are 126 nanosuits available in the game. Most of them are free, a couple require the acquisition of the DLCs. But each suit is clearly well done, aesthetically pleasing, and a pleasure to collect. The controversy may have introduced many players to Eve, but the craftsmanship behind her design is what ultimately keeps her memorable. This is how a 70 euros game should look and feel like. But aside from seeing these beautiful costumes in combat, there are other things to see as well.
Dans ma voix brûle ardemment de fragiles sentiments. Chaque note qui s'en évade porte un secret. Un battement dans le silence. Un cri noir.
Personally, I've never been a huge fan of collectibles. I rarely go out of my way to gather every hidden item scattered across an open world. And if you've seen my Dragon Age Inquisition video, you probably already know that I'm not particularly fond of world design built around dozens of small repetitive tasks whose only purpose is to inflate playtime. But as with every rule, there are exceptions. I've always had a soft spot for unusual collectibles. In Mafia 2, I collected every single Playboy magazine, not because they contained revealing photos, but because they were actually licensed magazines from the era. They added personality to the world and felt like authentic pieces of history rather than arbitrary checklist items. The same goes for the romance cards in The Witcher. Love them or hate them, they reflect the game's identity and gave the collectibles a sense of purpose beyond simply increasing a completion percentage. I suppose sex really does sell. But putting fan service aside, there is something else I genuinely enjoy in real life. Cans. No, seriously, I've always adored beverage can designs. Whether it's the clean elegance of a Red Bull can or the more extravagant artwork found on brands like Hell Energy, I find industrial packaging surprisingly fascinating. Good packaging is a form of design, and good design always catches my attention. So when I discovered that Stellar Blade lets you collect beverage cans throughout the world, I unexpectedly became obsessed with finding every single one. Oddly enough, I wasn't even interested in the reward. Every time you discover a new can, the game celebrates it with a satisfying sound effect, a stylish close-up animation, and Eve proudly presenting her latest find. It's a tiny moment, but one that perfectly demonstrates how presentation can make even the simplest mechanic feel rewarding. That's one of the reasons I enjoy collecting them so much. Stellar Blade doesn't merely hand you another icon for a checklist, it transforms every discovery into a small celebration. And sometimes that's all a collectible really needs. This makes me restate my opinion that visually and auditory rewards can make or break your video game. As for the side quests, they aren't exactly Stellar Blade's strongest aspect. For the most part, they follow familiar open world conventions: talk to an NPC, travel to a location, defeat a group of enemies, retrieve an item, and return for your reward. Structurally, there is very little here that feels particularly innovative. That being said, I never found them frustrating either. Their greatest strength lies in the rewards they provide. Whether it's Bitcoins used to purchase new outfits, upgrade materials, or additional lore, the game always gives the player something meaningful for their time. Since I quickly became invested into the fashion system, every side quest felt like another step toward unlocking a new costume rather than simply increasing a completion percentage. The quests that stand out the most are those tied to longer character storylines. In particular, the Singer's questline adds a surprisingly emotional layer to the world and demonstrates that Shift Up is capable of telling smaller, more intimate stories when it chooses to slow down the pacing. Overall, I'd describe the side content as competent rather than exceptional. It isn't compelling enough to justify exploring every optional marker on the map purely for its storytelling, but it's rewarding enough that I rarely felt my time had been wasted. Fishing is also part of the package. At this point, I've almost come to expect fishing whenever I play a Japanese or Korean game. Developers across East Asia seem to have an almost universal fascination with turning fishing into a relaxing side activity. Personally, I've never been particularly interested in fishing mechanics, and Stellar Blade didn't change my mind. It's perfectly functional, surprisingly polished, and serves as a pleasant break from combat, but it's not something I'd spend dozens of hours doing. At the end of the day, it's another welcome layer of optional content that helps make the world feel more lived in. I'll have to go back to my Dragon Age Inquisition video and revise one of my earlier statements. Stellar Blade is a perfect example of how not to fall into what I like to call Ubisoft open world trap. The optional activities here exist because they are genuinely enjoyable, not because the game needs to artificially inflate its playtime. Better yet, they are consistently rewarded with items that actually matter. Whether it's a new nanosuit, upgrade materials, Bitcoins, lore, collectibles, or simply the satisfaction of completing your collection, the game almost always gives you a meaningful reason to engage with its side content. And more importantly, you are never forced to do any of it. You do the side activities because you want to, because they are enjoyable, because you are curious about what you'll find next. That's a surprisingly rare design philosophy in modern open world games. The side content expands the experience instead of delaying it. It offers world building, character customization, meaningful progression, and occasionally even a welcome change of pace from the constant combat. To me, that's what optional content should be. Not mandatory work disguised as exploration, but genuine opportunities for players who simply want to spend more time in a world they already enjoy.
Fragile sentiment, chaque note qui s'en évade porte un secret, un battement dans le silence.
When Stellar Blade was first revealed, almost every discussion surrounding it revolved around the same topics. Was Eve's design appropriate? Was the game too sexualized? Was it a statement against modern trends? But very few people stopped to ask a much simpler question. Is it actually a good video game? After spending dozens of hours with it, I think the answer is a resounding yes. Not because it reinvents the action genre, and not because it tells the greatest story ever written, but because it understands something many modern AAA games seem to have forgotten. Games are supposed to be fun. Stellar Blade never loses sight of that objective. Its combat constantly rewards mastery, its visuals are among the strongest of this generation. Its fashion system celebrates player expression instead of monetizing it. And perhaps, most importantly, almost every system in the game exists because it makes the experience more enjoyable. Not because it artificially increases engagement metrics or extends the game's length. That's not to say the game is perfect. The side quests are mostly serviceable. The narrative, while interesting, rarely reaches the philosophical heights of NieR and is also pretty predictable. Some mechanics borrow very heavily from other games. The world can feel a bit repetitive in how many ways can you design a desert. But I don't believe originality should be treated as the highest virtue in game design. Execution matters just as much. And Stellar Blade executes its ideas remarkably well. If anything, the game demonstrates that borrowing ideas isn't a weakness when those ideas are properly understood. Great games have always learned from the games that came before them. Dark Souls learned from Zelda. Devil May Cry evolved from Resident Evil. NieR Automata was built upon Drakengard's decades of combat design, and now Stellar Blade stands on the shoulders of all of them. Rather than chasing trends or attempting to reinvent every aspect of the genre, Shift Up focused on refined, proven ideas until they form a cohesive whole. Ironically, after all the controversy surrounding Eve, the politics and the endless arguments online, I think history will remember Stellar Blade for something entirely different. Not as a game that started another culture war, but as the game that reminded people how satisfying a well-crafted single-player action game can still be. And if this is what Shift Up first AAA console project looks like, I genuinely can't wait to see what they create next. My name is Henry Hoffman Myers and this was my take on the design and systems of Stellar Blade. If you enjoyed this analysis, consider subscribing to Hexgrid Scientist for more in-depth analysis of video games as interactive systems. Thank you very much for watching and I will see you next time.